This is just a gentle reminder to please turn off your microphone. We will take questions at the end, so you're welcome to use the chat function to put your questions in, or you can put an X, and at the end, when we get to our questions, we will call on you. I would now like to turn over the floor to Gary Banta. He's the head of unit here at Biology, University of Southern Denmark, and he's also the coordinator for the NordSalt Project.
Great. Thank you very much, Jake. I hope you can hear me. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us for this kickoff meeting. We're really excited to have you here today and to tell you about this brand new biodiversity project called NordSalt. As of today, we're officially 3 weeks old, but we've been doing a little bit of work and preparing before today. Next, Jake. Yeah, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about what NordSalt is about in some general terms. And two of the sort of keywords in NordSalt are kind of in the title already. Nord referring to Nordic region, and salt being the short version of salt marshes. So, of course, this is a project related to salt marshes in the Nordic region. It's also part of the biodiversity program, so it should not be specifically the biodiversity call related to climate and biodiversity interactions. So those are two elements in this project as well. And finally, we're hoping to deliver some science and interact with stakeholders in a way that our results will be relevant and play a role in both environmental policy and management aspects. But before going too much in detail about what we're going to do and who we are, I'm actually really pleased to introduce, we have a guest speaker today, Marianne Olsen from the Nordic Council of Ministers. Marianne is a leader and coordinator of the Ocean and Climate Group of the Nordic Council of Ministers. And we've asked Marianne to come in and give a few words about how she might view a project like this from her perspective. So in a minute, just one more slide, Jake, before we introduce Marianne. I guess I wanted to say that our main angle into this project was related to the concept about blue carbon. And for those of you who have probably heard about the word blue carbon, it refers to the idea that marine forested ecosystems, including those on the edge called salt marshes, are important for carbon sequestration. And when talking about the idea of these blue carbon ecosystems, we realized that we didn't know nearly as much about salt marshes in the Nordic region. So that's sort of our approach to why we got interested in this project. So based on that, I'll turn the floor over to Marianne, where she can come with a little bit of her ideas. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you very much, Gary. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me today. My name is Marianne Olsen, and I'm lead and coordinator for the Nordic Group on Ocean and Climate. And I live in Oslo. I work at the Norwegian Environment Agency. And I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the Nordic Council of Ministers and talk a little bit about relevant policy areas and how the NordSalt project fits nicely into what's going on in the Nordic Council of Ministers. And also I was asked to maybe talk a little bit about how these projects can influence policy changes. So Jake, if you might take the next slide. Yeah, so for those of you who are not familiar with the Nordic Council of Ministers, it is a collaboration in the Nordic region, and all of these participants are along in the collaboration. And maybe if you see it at the left corner here, it's a swan, and it's that logo for the Nordic Council of Ministers. And for those of you who are not or maybe familiar with the official Nordic eco-label, you think that they are similar, and are there a connection between those two? And it is actually. And the reason I wanted to show you this is that I want to point to what we can achieve in the Nordic region when we work together, and the Nordic eco-label is a success story. So working together in the Nordic region, we can achieve great things. If you might click again, Jake. Yeah, so I'm a lead of the Ocean and Climate Group. It was established in 2019. And we are working in the nexus of the ocean and climate issues. And our first task was to coordinate a Nordic declaration on ocean and climate, which was signed in 2019 of the Nordic Environment and Climate Ministers. And today I will highlight what in the declaration is keywords for you. It mentioned natural carbon sinks in the Nordic sea areas. And I also want to mention that the Nordic Council of Ministers had recently a blue carbon project, which was called Blue Carbon and Nordic Blue Forests. Very briefly, I will talk a little bit about that. If you might click again. Yeah, and for policy relevance, I would like to highlight the wetland supplement. For those of you who are not familiar with that guideline, it's the IPCC guidelines to national greenhouse gas inventories. And it would be useful for this project to know about that guideline. And lastly, I will then talk a little bit about policy changes. So next slide, please, Jake. And we are entering a very exciting century in the Nordic region. We have a new vision for 2030. So the Nordic region wants to be the most green and sustainable region in the world. So that's a goal at the top right corner here. And to achieve all these goals, there are 12 focus areas that the Nordic wants to prioritize at the moment. And I would say that NordSalt fits quite nicely into both the number 1, achieving carbon neutrality, and number 2, maintaining biodiversity. And I will also in this section mention the health and welfare, because in the Nordic region we have a strong voice from the Nordic youth. And I think that it's important to communicate to the Nordic youth that we are actually taking a new course and give them hope for the future. So that's the Nordic collaboration. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here we see some photos of salt marshes in the Nordic region. And while you look at these, I will talk a little bit about the Nordic Declaration. So why did we want a Nordic Declaration? Well, we are an ocean region. We're highly dependent on our sea and coastal areas. And there has been a concern that the ocean has been forgotten as part of climate issues. So the Nordic region wanted to show our concern of the far-reaching implication of unabated climate change and ocean acidification for marine and coastal ecosystem and coastal communities, and also our ocean economy. And there are also many ocean initiatives going on the international arena at the moment, and the Nordic region wants to be part of that important dialogue. What we see when we work together in the Nordic region, that we have a stronger voice together, we are more significant. And we must admit, when we work nationally, we are quite small in the global context. And the Nordic Declaration is quite ambitious. And to highlight what's relevant in this context, I would say that it states that it wants to protect marine ecosystems as carbon sinks. And why do we want to protect them? Well, simply put, when a blue carbon habitat is lost, it no longer takes up and stores carbon. And this carbon will then remain in the atmosphere or in the ocean, contributing to global warming and ocean acidification. So protecting these marine areas as carbon sinks is regarded as a no-regret option, and also important for biodiversity as well. And also many ecosystem services, like improving water quality and serving as protection against coastal erosion, by severe weather events or also impacts of sea level rise. The declaration also states that we want to encourage and strengthen scientific research that would enable us to identify and maintain natural ocean carbon sinks. So I'm hoping that I'm able to encourage you a little bit today that the NordSalt Project is of relevance for us. I also mentioned that the Nordic Council of Ministers just had a project on Nordic blue carbon habitats or blue forest. It's just finished and it was funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers, but it was led by the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, NIVA. And that blue forest project did not include salt marshes, it included kelp, rockweed, and seagrasses. And they have a great website. I would advise you to take a look at it. But I think that it doesn't duplicate anything that's going on here because it doesn't involve salt marshes yet. And also, I would like to mention that the Ocean and Climate Group, which I'm leading, we are having our own salt marsh project this year, but that's about mapping salt marshes using satellite images. And Iceland, I can mention, has already done this on their part. And from a Norwegian management perspective, I can mention that we didn't actually know until quite recently that we had salt marshes in Norway. We knew of the coastal wetlands habitats, but we didn't know what salt marshes would entail for Norwegian nature. But we did the desktop study, and NIVA helped us with that. We found out that we actually have salt marshes in Norway as well, so that's exciting for us. And yeah, how can this project influence policy change? Well, I would like to highlight the wetland supplement again in chapter 4, because that will be an important maybe tool for you to, if you are familiar with that content, how you can influence policy changes and why this NordSalt project is relevant. I would also like you to remind the Nordic Council Minister, remind us about the declaration, what we said in it, and because it's not that we don't remember, but there are a lot of new people coming and going in the Nordic Council Ministers. Maybe sometimes we just need a reminder. And also, I would say that you have a challenge in communicating to the right policy makers, because you're in the nexus between climate and biodiversity, and in the Nordic region, they don't often work together. So you have an interaction, you have to bridge a gap between the policymakers. That's the challenge. And also, you have another challenge with salt marshes in particular, because then you have to bridge the gap between management working on land use and also the coastal management. And they're often not working together as well. So just pointing out some important challenges for you. And I will also highlight that if you communicate the results in ways that are easy accessible for policymakers, I think that you will have great success. It needs to be short and to the point, and also timely. So aim, if you know there are relevant international Nordic processes, aim for that arena. Maybe if you know about ocean climate dialogue, aim for that. And also aim for the IPCC and CBD work. Mm-hmm. And I see my time is running up, but I would like to have some final remarks from me. As a lead coordinator for the Ocean and Climate Group, I would also like to try and strengthen the Nordic research on salt marshes by facilitating that we can have an arena where we could talk more and share our knowledge and our experiences, and yeah, come together. And so I hope we can talk more very soon, and thank you for your time. I hope this was useful. I'm looking forward to hear more about NordSalt.
Great. Thank you very much, Mariana. Thank you so much for helping motivate both us in the consortium and the audience about some of the challenges we ourselves have identified as a reason we were interested in this project, not least of which that limbo that you mentioned between being in the sea or on land, and also not really knowing that we have something called salt marshes or something in that category in the Nordic regions. So, and we will do our best to take up the gauntlet of being policy relevant and engaging and communicative. That's certainly one of our goals. So thank you very much. So now I would like to move on. And actually, Marianne's sort of introduced this. One of our challenges in this project is, what is a Nordic salt marsh? I grew up in the US and worked on salt marshes on the east coast of the US where they all look the same. They're all made of Spartina. And part of the Northern European region salt marshes look like that as well. They're Spartina dominated. But when we stretch all the way to the inner parts of the Baltic Sea, where in Finland, we have completely different kinds of coastal marsh habitats, and they have many different names. They're called salt marshes, salt meadows, salt swamps, reed beds, etc. So one of our challenges is to try to get a better handle on where are our Nordic salt marsh habitats. Next slide, please. So overall, the main topics or goals of NordSalt can be summarized in this. Upper left is sort of trying to show a regional map and a temporal change. So one of our tasks is to try to identify where these habitats are and how they've been changing and what kind of environmental pressures they are under. Next to the right is a interaction between biodiversity and climate, which makes good sense that this is front and center, but we will especially be focusing on climate-related carbon cycling, blue carbon, and how it interacts with biodiversity in these salt marsh communities, especially with focus on the plant communities. You'll hear more about all these from some of the consortium members in a bit. Luckily, the bottom two ones, I hope, are partially fulfilling Marianne's wishes, that we are going to be trying to engage with stakeholders, everyone from policy-based stakeholders to local land users and other interest groups, and try to express the value of these salt marsh ecosystems from an ecosystem services point of view. And we are actually explicitly trying to explore the relevance and role of these blue carbon habitats in a nature-based solution perspective. So I hope we will deliver some of Marianne's wishes in the next 3 years. Next slide, please. How are we going to do this? I'm not going to go into detail here, but basically our project is organized around case studies. Basically one case study in all the Nordic countries, including Germany, honorary Nordic country for this project, and where we cover the range of these salt marsh habitats. We will be doing a number of field measurements, including both fluxes and pool measurements. We will be engaging stakeholders in each of the local cases to discuss these habitats. Bottom right, you'll see that one of our fundamental structuring elements in this project is the fact that the most common management practice, which has a huge impact on the plant communities, is whether you have livestock grazing or not. So we will be comparing grazed and non-grazed habitats throughout this region. So next slide, please. A little bit about how this came to be. I've shown a little bit, and in some ways Marianne's already introduced us to this journey, but basically I see this as a project whose time has come, where some interests have converged. I put two circles about my personal journey. I worked in New England, northeastern US, on salt marshes, and those are the ones that look on the left. And I moved to Denmark, where I've done most of my research, and in more recent times have worked on salt marshes in Denmark, including with my colleague Dorte Krause Jensen, who you'll meet in a minute. And one of the seminal events was the Blue Carbon Initiative meeting that was held in Copenhagen in September of 2019. And I believe Marianne was also present at this meeting, as was many of the consortium members. And where we really realized that we didn't know what we wanted to about Nordic salt marshes. So that was where we started thinking about, okay, we need to think about this and we need to pull the team together. Next slide, please. So a little bit about me, other than just being at the University of Southern Denmark, my background is as a broad marine coastal ecosystems ecologist. I tend to work on things on the seafloor, but I also have worked on salt marshes. So that's sort of my background that brings me to this. I have an education from the US, so I'm familiar with salt marsh ecosystems over there, but I've done most of my grown-up science in Denmark. So I've worked on both sides of the Atlantic and hope to bring that to this team. So next slide, please. So here's the consortium, and I'm really happy to introduce you to the consortium. As you can see, we have members from all of the Nordic countries, including Germany. And what I'm going to do now is actually introduce someone from each of the teams so they can say a little bit about yourselves. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Rachel Tiller from SINTEF in Norway. So Rachel, I think you're on.
Wonderful, yes, and I'm not sure you've seen the next slide yet. Yep, there we go. I am going to try to fulfill some of Marianne's wishes on governance. So this is what I call the governance dimension of biodiversity protection. Next. And my name is Rachel Tiller. I'm a senior research scientist at SINTEF Ocean. So I'm part of a small but very experienced team of social scientists who are working closely with biologists, marine chemists, with a whole range of more technical researchers. So we've been on a number of projects where we have worked a lot on this deep integration of stakeholders. Next. And one of the things I have to really want to applaud this project for, because I came in fairly early, not as early as the conference in Copenhagen that Gary was referring to, but as you can see, most of the traditional projects that I'm invited into, or that social scientists are invited into, come as a tag on fairly late in the progress as work package 7 customarily, when everybody realizes they need to have stakeholders involved. But the NordSalt team here really wanted to go for a deeper integration right from the start with the stakeholders and put governance up front and center, because they did realize that if you don't do that, then you have challenges with both legitimacy, you have challenge in implementation once a project is done, and then you get challenges with compliance. So deep interdisciplinarity, however, is more difficult because, as you can see, it's not a straightforward path. You don't know what's around that bend. You don't know who's going to be at these meetings. You don't know what you're going to get out of it. And it's a lot more work. Next. And you will have noticed in the map that Gary showed us was that we also had this, we're going to have workshops in every single one of these countries. So we'll be having them in 5 countries. But like when you're counting fish in the oceans, you don't just do that once, you do that many times because things change, which is why we're also doing workshops twice in this one with the same types of stakeholders. The team that's primarily a lot of biologists are really going deep into the methodology that I specialize in, and they are running the workshops to make sure that we do get the stakeholders come in to feel that they are part of the process and not having to listen to me speak, but speaking to those that are actually in their region. So they're spending a lot of time on actually integrating really well with this. And next, what we're also going to be doing is looking at something called this political, experimental political panel survey. We're doing that also in all 5 countries, which is going to be it's a larger survey where we ask the regular people, not those that are directly involved either in coastal management or in land use management, but in just regular people at the sea, on the sea, in the cities, wherever. Next. And then we're doing also what Marianne suggested. We are going into observational studies, international governance arenas. That is another one of my special areas where we integrate ourselves into observations of the big processes, but we also arrange side events. And what we want to do here is arrange side events on Nordic salt marshes. And as Marianne said, to make sure that we are timely, that we are there when they want us to be there and when it's necessary for us to be there. Next. So with that, I am going to turn you over to my colleague Christopher in Finland, who is one of these researchers that are going to be having all these stakeholder workshops and be part of this process that we have here that's very interdisciplinary. And then, Christopher, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everybody. It's very nice to see this top interest for this new project. So just briefly, I'm leading the work package 2, which is focusing on the dynamics and extent of Nordic coastal marshes. And the situation in Finland at the moment is that we have lost a lot of these traditionally managed salt meadows. So we have less than 10% of what we had previously. What is, however, increasing rapidly are the reed belts. So this is a little bit of the background here. Next slide. We are in a very fortunate situation, however. We have a new program called the Helmi Habitat Program, which is going on until 2030. Helmi is Pearl in English, if you didn't know that. And this is partly supporting us very much because it's focusing on restoring bird habitats and wetlands and managing grasslands and so on, and also restoration of shore habitats. So we're looking forward to collaborate with people involved in this program. Next slide. So a little bit about myself. I'm a marine biologist. I have not worked with salt marshes. My team partner here, Mikael von Numers, he's a terrestrial botanist, also good in GIS and habitat modeling and so on. And the third member of the Finnish team is Jukka Alm at the Natural Resource Institute, and he's a greenhouse gas exchange expert. So I worked previously with seagrasses, and this is what you see to the right here. If you click further, this is my main home habitat so far, but if you click further, Jake, you can see that this is actually equally important in terms of carbon sequestration, if not even more important. So we're now moving the focus from the open sea to the inner bays. Next slide. So what is Åbo Academy doing here in this project? Well, we are looking into the gaps that Gary pointed out, the classification systems, trying to understand how they work. Are they operational? We are going to collect data based on from databases and aerial photographs, and we are also interested in loss drivers and these aerial extents in order to calculate carbon sequestration rates on a national basis in each country. We are also keen on really diving into the habitat classification types and see if they are really sufficiently operational at the moment, or based on the data we are finding out. And of course, we are keen to provide input to management and see how these habitats could serve as nature-based solutions. And this is happening through stakeholders. We are working with the team also in field, not only as a desk exercise. So we're looking into the pressures in the field, also the stocks and fluxes of gases and the biodiversity as a response and regulator of climate change. Next slide. So I end off here by showing a few examples of the dramatic difference between a grazed and an ungrazed coastal meadow in Finland. And I believe I also had another example here, the last slide. So this is how it looks when a coastal meadow in Finland is grazed for almost 100 years. And there in the background is an ungrazed coastal meadow. So with these words, I passed on to my colleague Dorte in Denmark.
Thank you, Christopher, and thank you everyone for joining us here. So I will be talking about the role of Aarhus University in NordSalt, and we'll be concentrating our efforts on the coordinated Nordic studies on salt marsh carbon stocks and carbon sequestration and their blue carbon potential. Yeah, next, please. The Aarhus University team consists of Francisca Eller and Hans Brex and myself, and we will hire a postdoc to join us. And our team combines expertise on marsh ecophysiology and traits with knowledge on blue carbon and nature-based solutions. So Francisca and Hans have been working a lot in marsh ecophysiology and traits and gas fluxes, and I've been more focused on blue carbon in general, and been working mostly on seagrasses and macroalgae, but the last couple of years also on salt marshes in Denmark in collaboration with colleagues at Aarhus and Southern University of Denmark. Yes, next please. Yes, so our role will be on assessing carbon stocks and carbon sequestration rates in the Danish sites, but also to coordinate the Nordic studies on this. So to make sure that we have coordinated studies that are comparable across the region. So next slide, please. And we are lucky that we already have some background information from national habitat monitoring and existing data in Denmark. And as Denmark is right at the interface between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, we both have the traditional classical salt marshes that Gary talked about in the Wadden Sea, and also more protected marsh habitats, salt meadows in the inner Danish waters. And we are very, I can say that we have a total of about 40,000 hectares of salt marsh in Denmark that has been assessed from the habitat monitoring going on. And then in a recent project in collaboration with Gary from University of Southern Denmark, we have assessed some preliminary carbon stocks and sequestration rates of salt marshes in Denmark. And we are really excited about this Nordic gradient comparison and about informing blue carbon management. So next, please. And here from the beginning of the project, we are identifying the candidate sites, contrasting history of grazed environments with non-grazed. And in each of these sites, it's the idea that we will take both cores to assess the carbon stocks in the sediments. We'll date the cores and measure the carbon content so that we can assess sequestration rates. But over the season, we'll also measure greenhouse gas fluxes in flux chambers. And this is where we are now in search for these sites. And now to my colleague Kai Jensen in Germany. Thank you.
Yes, thank you also. Thank you, Dorte. Thank you all for being here. And thank you also for letting me be part of this project, although I'm not located in a Nordic country, I learned recently. I feel like I'm living in a Nordic country and I was born close to the border to Denmark, but to be honest, so I'm not really living in a Nordic country, I'm living in Germany. So our focus at the University of Hamburg in this project is to analyze the effects, possible effects of climate change on these Nordic salt marshes. And I would like to give first a background about me, please. The next slide. So next slide, please, Jake. Yes, thank you. So I'm a plant ecologist by training, and I have longer experience in salt marsh research. So we have been working for about 20 years already in salt marshes, and we are mainly interested in biodiversity and ecosystem functioning of these habitats. And I have been working mostly in Wadden Sea salt marshes during the last years. We've published also the first assessment of blue carbon potential of these Wadden Sea salt marshes 2 years ago. And the major, the first author on that, or the person who really worked on that during the last years, Peter Müller, who is now a postdoc at CERC and also postdoc at the University of Hamburg. So we have also experience with complex experimental setups to study effects of global warming on salt marshes. And that is also the reason why we are here in the team responsible for looking at effects of climate change on these habitats. So we run since 2018 the so-called MERIT experiment, Marsh Ecosystem Response to Increased Temperature, in the Wadden Sea on the Hamburger Hallig. And on this picture you can see me here, taken by Svenja. She's also here today. So we went there last week and started to rebuild the experiment. In this experiment in the Wadden Sea salt marshes, we combine a below ground active heating treatment with an above ground dome approach for increasing temperatures above ground. These domes are partly covered with foil later on. And we run this experiment each year from early April until the end of September. So in NordSalt, next slide please, we will have the aim to study possible effects of climate change on these ecosystems. And our major task is to carry out a mesocosm experiment, a mesocosm warming experiment. And the first step in doing so is to establish a wetland climate change facility directly located at the University of Hamburg. And in this new facility, we will then run a warming experiment with salt marshes or salt marsh blocks from Finland, from Sweden, and from Denmark. We will go there and excavate smaller pieces of salt marshes, and both from grazed and from ungrazed habitats, so that we can compare the response of shortgrass and tallgrass marsh communities to warming. And in this experiment, we will then mainly focus on carbon fluxes and greenhouse gas emissions. And the main person in charge for doing so is the postdoc Simon Thomsen, which we hired for this project. And I'm really happy that we were able to get him. Next slide, please, because he's the best suited candidate you can think of. He has experience in analyzing vegetation composition of Nordic salt marshes. Here you can see him as a student in Estonia 2008. Estonia is not part of the Nordic region, I learned earlier, but it is still a Baltic grassland. He studied also at that time the culture of the Nordic countries, because he was interested in all these different beers which were available in Finland and Estonia on our field trip. And during the last years, he concentrated on running these climate change experiments. So he is in charge also managing, together with a colleague from the United States, our warming experiment at the Hamburger Hallig, and now he will be in charge for running the mesocosm experiment at the University of Hamburg as part of NordSalt. And the final slide, please. As I said earlier, we have longer experience in salt marshes, so we have looked on effect of we have analyzed effects of management, mainly grazing, on biodiversity, which you can see on the upper left panel. So we analyzed effects of grazing on biodiversity. We've also analyzed effects of grazing or management on ecosystem functioning, lower right panel. I'm personally interested in plant adaptations to stress. So we analyzed also interactions between plants and their stressful environment, which you can see a nice picture on the bottom left. And all the work we carry out is mainly connected to salt marsh or to wetland conservation and wetland restoration, as you can see as an example also on the upper right panel. In addition to all this work, we can offer to the NordSalt consortium also many enthusiastic students, and I'm pretty sure that the project will also benefit from integrating all these students. And with that, I would like to hand over to Sweden. Johan, the screen is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. So I will be leading the fourth work package on marsh plant biodiversity patterns and ecosystem services. Next slide. So I work as an associate professor in marine biology at Stockholm University, but I typically tend to define myself more as an ecosystem ecologist who's happened to work mainly in shallow coastal ecosystems like seagrass beds, mussel banks, and coral reefs. So this project now means a sort of step up on land for me, which I find very, very interesting. Much of the research that I and my research group do focuses on the causes and consequences of biodiversity in the broad sense of the word. So partly then what explains spatial and temporal patterns in biodiversity, and on the other hand, how does variability in biota and biodiversity in turn influence ecosystem processes up to the level of nature's benefits to humans? And to address these questions, we typically use a combination of different types of methods that I bring into the NordSalt project, for example, multi-factor field experiments, time series analysis, but also comparative field surveys along natural and anthropogenic gradients. Also part here of the Stockholm University NordSalt team, and to make up for my limited expertise in terrestrial plant communities, we're very happy to have Sarah Cousins, who's extensively studied boreal coastal meadows and the drivers of their biodiversity, particularly from historical landscapes perspective. Next, please. So this fourth work package that I laid has two main aims, partly to link NordSalt plant biodiversity to carbon cycling and coastal protection. And this we will do partly using the multi-site field service, but also the mesocosm experiment that Kai mentioned earlier. We will also look at the impacts of expected climatic changes, particularly in terms of near future warming, on biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and greenhouse gas fluxes. And this will be done mainly through the mesocosm experiment. Next, please. So one of the key deliverables, as I see it, of the NordSalt project will be to go beyond the current state-of-the-art knowledge on the main drivers of coastal meadow plant community or NordSalt habitat community composition and diversity. We know that these drivers include aspects like grazing, wave exposure, and geological history. But to take this one step further, to assess how relatively important are these plant communities and their biodiversity for the generation of key ecosystem services of these Nord-South habitats, specifically carbon cycling and soil stabilization. Next, please. And taking one step further, this goal also includes predicting how changes in abiotic drivers, including climatic change, but also changes in, for example, grazing management, may impact plant biodiversity directly and then indirectly the generation of ecosystem services. Next, please. But this also includes to assess whether high plant biodiversity or certain types of plant communities may actually buffer the impacts of environmental, including climatic changes. Next, please. So for quite wet and salty ecologists like myself, taking these steps up on land, in the sense that outside my own comfort zone, is something that I'm very much looking forward to. And this is partly because we are a very strong team with very different backgrounds and therefore very complementary experiences and expertises. And through that complementarity, combined with the presence of these vast environmental and biodiversity gradients of the Nord-South habitats, I think this opens up for a very interesting possibility to generate a much better understanding of the role of biota and biodiversity for blue carbon ecosystem services, also in a more general sense. And with that, I hand over back to Gary.
Great, thank you, Johan, and thank you. I think Johan, you took part of my speech away. I was going to comment on how I think excited we are to work together in this very diverse consortium. So we apologize to the audience if we're overly excited about what we think we can do together, but we think we have a really cool team, and we look forward to both actually getting to meet when COVID gets a little bit easier. I want to wind up by giving a huge thanks to our funders. This is a project that's funded by the European Union and the Biodiverse subprogram in that, which is focused on biodiversity and climate interactions in this case. But this is a co-funded program, so this means that all of our national funders have had to say yes to our project as well. So we're extremely pleased that we've been supported by each of our national funders. And then I would be amiss not to give a big shout out to both Harold Hassel-Schiele and Elizabeth Garwison from SDU and Aarhus University, who helped us in the process of pulling together this interesting project proposal and helping push us over the edge. So thank you, guys. So next slide, please. I know we have some time, which is good, but in case, I know what tends to happen when we open up for questions. So some of you have other obligations. So I wanted to put this slide in, which is we hope to hear from you during the course of the project. There are multiple ways to stay in touch. We have a homepage, we have a Twitter tag, and you can especially get in contact through either myself or Jake as project manager. So we hope to hear from you.